I'm Abby Cabunoc Mays. I lead GitHub's open source maintainer programs, and I'll be your host for today. So we have a great fireside chat as part of GitHub Universe. We'll have a conversation with Indeed on how they approach open source sponsorship using GitHub sponsors, the FOSS Contributor Fund, and more. So joining me today, we have Duane O'Brien. He is the director of open source at Indeed and the creator of the FOSS Contributor Fund. He loves telling the story of open source through collaboration and conversation. Dwayne is a force of chaotic good, using his high stats and intelligence and charisma to advocate for the open source community. If you encounter him in a forested area, he will share his fire, drink, and philosophy. Welcome, Dwayne.
Thank you. My writing partner on the FOSS Contributor Fund book will be tickled that you used that introduction. She wrote that one for me. It's
great, and I think it really describes you as someone who I've mostly met at conferences. Yeah, That's a forested area. That is a great place to get you, and you'll share your fire and philosophy.
Thanks. I lean on the forest metaphor a lot when we talk about sustaining and maintaining the open source ecosystem, and so it's a metaphor that I think has a lot of power and resonates well.
Yeah, I just saw you tweet about that. Could you explain it a little bit more as a bit of background?
What I was talking about is the idea that we need to think about the open source ecosystem the way you think about a forest, and the health of the ecosystem the way you think about the health of a forest ecosystem. And so if you go in and clear cut a bunch of trees in a forest, it takes ages for that forest to recover, right? And there's all kinds of activity in the forest besides the trees that is really important. There are things happening in the understory. There are things happening under the dirt. There are all of these different aspects of activity in the ecosystem. And I think that's very true of what we see in open source as well. There are some big trees that everybody knows about. There are some big organizations that go into forests, and they may or may not behave responsibly in that. But if we want that ecosystem to survive for us long term, we have to care for it the way that you would care for any other ecosystem.
Yeah, I love that. And I think especially this conversation on sustainability, the environment is really what comes to mind. So I think that's a perfect metaphor for this space. Cool. So going back a little bit more, Dwayne, do you want to tell me about your open source origin story? How did you get into this space, and how did you get started?
I would say open source adjacent for a lot of years. I was a passionate consumer, but not a very active contributor. My first contribution was on a bug tracking system called Mantis, which probably no one remembers at this point. And I had tripped over a bug where it was, well, this might date it, where it was working on regular Windows systems, but not Windows NT, right? And when I identified the one-line change that would fix this, I reached out to the maintainer and told them what it was, and they said I should just go ahead and submit it. And it just seemed like it was too easy, right? Like I wrote a check to say, if this is Windows NT, do something different. And suddenly it just worked for me. And I thought for a long time, like, it can't be that simple, really, but it is. And everybody gets started in open source. A lot of people get started in open source, like fixing the small bug that seemed like it was too easy, right? And so I was a passionate user for a long time. And then about 9 years ago, I stepped into a role at PayPal leading operations for their open source program office. Was there for about 3.5 years, and then joined Indeed in 2017 to lead and build their open source program office from scratch. And I've been there ever since.
Yeah, and can you tell me a bit more about Indeed's OSSO and what it does? Open Source Program Office, if you're not familiar with the OSSO acronym.
We drive our work in the Open Source Programs Office through 3 core initiatives. We enable the effective use of open source, we sustain our open source infrastructure, and we tell compelling stories about our work. And so we do some work internally to make sure that Indeedians who want to use open source have the support that they need, and have help from us in trying to identify if projects are healthy or unhealthy, and look for opportunities to help people get better at using it. The open source that we depend on, we want to play an active role as sustainers in those projects. We do a lot of that through funding. We do some of that through code contributions, and also making sure that those conferences that you mentioned are supported and healthy places for the community to come together. And then telling compelling stories about our work. We go out and we do talks, we write blog posts internally, we are excited about the work that we do, and we love telling people about it.
So you talked a bit about, funding the ecosystem. So what are you funding as part of your overall open source sustainability operation?
We break our funding down into about 4 categories. We have conferences and events. Sometimes we show up at large conferences, sometimes we show up at small conferences. Sometimes we sponsor them but may not show up, just to help make sure that there are community events happening in different areas. We do sponsorship of foundations and member organizations and trade organizations, the Apache Software Foundation, Software Freedom Conservancy, and so on. We also fund interns through Outreachy. I guess so there's 5 categories. We fund interns through Outreachy, which I think is a different stream. And then we do a lot of funding of projects and people. And the FOSS Contributor Fund is the framework that we use to decide which projects we want to sponsor. And then we have a different process to identify which people we want to sponsor. And we look for people who are having a broad impact across a wide range of dependencies as opposed to activity within a single project.
Can you tell me a little bit more about how you choose the projects and people that you sponsor? You mentioned a little bit, but I'd like to hear more.
Sure. We developed a framework in 2018 and started applying it in 2019 called the FOSS Contributor Fund. And that is our decision-making framework for identifying projects that Indeed relies on that we want to financially support. The way the FOSS Contributor Fund works is everyone at Indeed who makes open source contributions over a given period of time gets the opportunity to vote on dependencies that Indeed uses. And it doesn't have to be necessarily in a product stack or an infrastructure stack. It could be the software we use to book conference rooms or other pieces of software. As long as it's used at Indeed, it's eligible. The people who make contributions vote on projects, and the project that gets the most vote gets a $10,000 one-time sponsorship from Indeed. And we use that process to drive that decision-making down to developers and broad across the organizations, because people who use the technology every day are, I think, best equipped to say, this is really important to my work. And they also have the broadest visibility into those projects. So if the project says, hey, we need help, this is a pathway now for them to raise those concerns for us. We started sponsoring people a couple of years ago when GitHub Sponsors for Companies was first announced. And this really came out of an observation as we were analyzing dependencies and digging into the projects that we should support, that there were a lot of contributors who were making contributions across a wide range of small projects, or some maintainers who were maintaining a lot of little things. And it was very difficult for the breadth of those contributions or projects to carry the weight of the vote against projects that had strong name recognition, right? Mm-hmm. So we built up a new process that looks at all contributors across all of our projects and breaks them into different cohorts by language ecosystem, and looks at how many contributions they've made and how much or that we appear to be using that project and how many projects they've contributed to. And we use that as the starting point for the investigation that we do to figure out who the people are that we want to sponsor. And there's some other pieces that go into our ultimate decision making there. But I think that's a interesting complement to funding projects, because projects have a scope, projects have goals, projects might have specific improvements that they want to fund or specific things they want to accomplish with their goals. They might also have governance models that can support influxes of larger funding. Individuals who are looking to self-fund their work or to earn a little money by making open source contributions, it's a very different scenario. And so we began this process so that we could learn more about it and get a better understanding of who are the people that are important at the center of open source.
That's super interesting. Yeah, so I really enjoy your the FOSS Contributor Fund process, how you've opened up the process itself, so that it's really the whole company that's deciding this. And you're making sure that you're giving money to the projects that most need this, or that's most used by your community. Why is directly supporting maintainers important to you and Indeed?
We keep coming back to this idea that open source is people, right? Like there's code, yes, but people create that code, right? Mm-hmm. Projects don't burn out, maintainers burn out, right? When a project reaches a point of crisis, the maintainer pulls it down because they can't maintain it anymore, or the maintainer is underwater and the project becomes unhealthy, or there is suddenly a high profile vulnerability in the project and they don't have the support that they need. The code doesn't have the ability to change anything. It's the people who can change things, right? And so supporting people, if you care about open source sustainability, is the only way to get there, right? And there's a lot of different forms that support can take. We talk a lot about money because money is sort of an easy thing for companies and people to understand, but somebody still has to turn money into time and time into code, and those are people, right? And so we want to support the people who are involved in these projects just as much as we want to support the projects, because they are the ones who need more sleep, would like to take a vacation, are feeling the burden of maintaining a project, right? We also can show up for projects as people and help relieve some of that maintainer burden and help them with those projects more directly.
Because looking at the open source ecosystem, I think a lot of burden is put on maintainers right now to keep the project running, to do all this work. So I'm really glad that people like you are really thinking about getting that money directly to maintainers. Even though we know that so much more than money is needed, I think it's a great start. So thank you for that.
One of the things that we talk about, and that you and I have had a couple of conversations over time, is this idea of project governance, and I think it's something that we have to talk about in the context of any conversation around money, because when you add money to an open source project that didn't have money, everything changes, right? And the project needs a decision-making framework for what to do with that money before it shows up. And that's easy if it's pizza money. It's hard if it's rent money, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that's really challenging about identifying projects that you want to support is understanding what to look for in a project that has good governance. And are they going to be able to handle a drive-by single and sponsorship of $10,000, or is that going to create disharmony in the project, right? When you look at funding individuals are their own governance models, right? If they have hung out the shingle and said, I'm looking to get raise some sponsors for the work that I do, they're the ones who make the decision. I think it clarifies some aspects of it. It can still create disharmony if there are some individuals for a project who are raising money as individuals and some who are not. But I think the conversations are different when you're funding people versus projects. Both are important. But I just think there are different considerations.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I was talking to Fernando Perez, the head of the Jupyter project, a couple weeks ago, and he was saying they weren't getting taken seriously for funding until they sent their written governance documentation to the big company they were getting funding from. And it gives so much more trust in the project that it's like, oh, these are grown-ups who know what they're doing. But it is very different for a person. It's like, how do I trust that you're a grown-up who knows how to spend money? But should I do that question? Yeah.
Well, I think it's important also to acknowledge that, at least based on what I've seen across the people that we sponsor or that are looking for sponsorship in that group of contributors, many folks are just looking for a little bit of a thank you. They have extremely modest goals. I'd like to be able to take my partner to a meal once a month. I would like to have a coffee, right? I would like someday to have 6 people think my work is so important that they want to sponsor me, right? And in particular, if you're sponsoring from within an organization, showing up as the first sponsor for someone can have a really strong emotional impact for them. Right.
Yeah.
It can also send a signal to other people that there may be value in the work that this person is doing, and you should pay attention. There are definitely people who self-fund entirely through their open source work and who aspire to self-fund entirely through their open source work, but at least based on what I've seen, that's not the vast majority of people. The vast majority of people, like, if they're asking for money, would like a little bit of something to say thank you.
Has Indeed been the first sponsor for a project before?
We started sponsoring someone toward the beginning of the year, and we were one of their very first sponsors, and our sponsorship was extremely small, right? It might have been on the order of $20 to $50 a month. I don't remember off the top of my head. And they emailed us right away and expressed like so much gratitude because they had been working on a project for years and
Yeah.
they were just starting to see this kind of recognition for their project. And they talked about how that kept them going, right? You know what it's like. You're working hard, and when someone takes the time to stop and say, "Hey, I see you working hard and thank you," that has
Yeah.
an energizing effect, especially if you spend a lot of time buried in feature requests from people who don't understand the complexities of the project, or fielding issues from people who are angry that something doesn't work and you don't have any context for their issue. And there's a lot of potential negativity that you have to deal with as a maintainer.
Mhm.
And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface on what it really means to support people through that.
Yeah.
But in that context, having somebody stop and say, "No, really, I appreciate you," that can go a long way.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, there's a lot of demands on open source maintainers. So I'm glad we're starting to surface that more so people are understanding it and starting to fund them more. So you've been talking a bit about selection. So what hurdles exist in getting funds to these people or in selecting the projects?
I'm going to break those into two different questions. Hurdles in getting funds to people. Platforms like Open Collective and GitHub Sponsors and some of the other funding platforms have helped, certainly. It is very difficult for an organization like Indeed or any other significantly large company to write a check to a random person somewhere in the world. Right there are
Yeah.
procedural problems for a good reason inside organizations that prevent that. There are legal frameworks for good reasons that prevent
Yeah.
that, right? And so, where I think the platforms have really helped us is they've enabled companies like Indeed to deal with a single vendor to write a bunch of checks. We sponsored on the order of 150 or so maintainers at the first part of this year. If I had to process 150 individual transactions for folks,
You'd still
that
be
would have been
processing it today.
I'd still be processing it, right? And we had one experience with the FOSS Contributor Fund where, in order to sponsor the project, we had to send a check to a university, and it was so many hurdles, right?
Yeah.
And so the challenge though is that there's a lot of open source that doesn't happen on these platforms, right? And if there are projects who are looking for funding and they're not on the platforms where it's easier for organizations to pay them, that money's going to flow in the path of least resistance. It's going to go to the projects that are easy to pay. And that's going to create problems for us long term because some of the projects that aren't easy to pay are still important. And we have to pay attention to that. We have to make sure that those projects, some of whom explicitly never want money, are getting support in the other forms that they need it, right? I guess another issue, and this bridges us from projects to people, is understand what's really important in your organization is not an easy task, right? It's a complicated task, and we have spent a lot of time and invested a lot of time analyzing our dependencies, understanding our dependencies. And when I say dependency here, I want to come back to that metaphor of money flowing through the path of least resistance. The easiest information to get about your dependencies comes out of your package dependencies.
Right.
There's all kinds of infrastructure underneath that doesn't show up in your package dependencies. And so we've spent a lot of time to understand what those dependencies are and really try to get a handle on it. Not everyone has that time, right? It's appealing to write checks to organizations who can simplify that complexity. We don't have time to analyze our dependencies. Give us the money and flatten out across our developers. We don't have time, right? Or tell us what's important. We'll sign a check. And in particular, if you talk to executive sponsors who are technical and understand open source, you don't have to convince them that open source is important to your organization. And if
Yeah.
you tell them a project or an open source community is in financial distress and needs help, they're likely to say, like, who do I write a check to, right? And so it's the other end, understanding what's important. Now, in 2020, Julia Ferrioli gave a great talk at the State of the Source about understanding your dependencies and how to identify which ones are important to your organization. I encourage people to go check that out. One of the things that we have to do is, first off, break them into language areas, because if you just sort by popularity or number of commits or something like that, the JavaScript TypeScript community is extremely granular, and they dominate like the lists of counts, right? So
Yeah.
You have to break it according to language cohorts, for one. You also have to break it by sort of areas of business importance. And so there is a lot of work involved in the process in trying to get it right. That work will teach you about your dependencies, but you can only spend the time that you have on it. So, like, don't be daunted by the task. The more you investigate your dependencies, the more you understand them, the better your decisions will be. Occasionally, you're going to make decisions that aren't optimal, and you use that as information to make better decisions down the line. So, when it comes to funding people and deciding who we're going to fund and how much we're going to fund them, one of the problems is that across those 150 maintainers or contributors, they all have different goals. They're all offering different models for sponsorship. Some of them don't want to do sort of a transactional style. They don't want to say, I'll fix bugs for $50 or host a talk for $500, right? They're just looking for $20 to $40, and maybe they'll say thank you. Managing that at scale is very challenging. Understanding how to account for all the factors in who you're going to support is a challenge. If you've got two maintainers, both of them looking to raise $500 a month, if one of them is extremely well funded and the other one is not extremely well funded, that's a thing that you want to factor in your decision making process. If one of them is located in an expensive part of the world and one of them is located in a very inexpensive part of the world, the meaning of that $500 is very different. There are all these other areas in which you have to pay attention. You have to look at how are you flowing your funds equitably through the ecosystem? Are you gauging the right level of sponsorship versus anticipated impact or health of the projects that you're wanting to sponsor? It's complicated, but it doesn't get less complicated by not trying. I think we're collectively still learning as an industry how to measure the impact of these kinds of financial sponsorships. Do we see projects getting healthier when we are funding them? Do we see people getting healthier when we are funding and sponsoring them? There's a lot of work there to do There's a lot of work there to do for everyone, but I think we're working on the problem.
We've been talking a lot about open source sustainability now. How do you think this area has changed over the years?
The evolution of the platforms is definitely one thing. One of the things that I think GitHub Sponsors has done for us as an unintended but extremely positive side effect is we now have a machine readable file that we can go digging for to try to figure out how many projects even want funding, right? It's not perfect. There's a lot of open source that isn't covered there. There's a lot of open source that's mirrored on GitHub but maybe isn't actively developed there. But 4 years ago, if I wanted to figure out which of my dependencies were thinking about asking for money or had any kind of sponsorship goals, or which of the contributors to my dependencies had their own sponsorship goals, there was just no way to get at that information at scale. And that is a thing I will come back to when it comes to organizations being involved in open source. It does no good if every project has their own way of doing it. I have thousands of projects that I have to figure out who and what to fund, right? I have to prioritize the ones that are important, and I have to understand this problem at scale. And I think we're still getting there. But the evolution of the platforms has made this easier for projects. It's made it easier to unlock funding from individuals and from organizations. We're starting to see machine readable information cross ecosystem at scale for projects that are looking for funding. And we've seen a couple of really interesting outcomes. One of my favorite is the work that's gone on in the ESLint community, where they started receiving funding. They received a couple of distributions from the FOSS Contributor Fund and some other people who run the FOSS Contributor Fund framework. And they began passing those funds directly down to people who were making individual contributions into the project who were not part of the project team.
Oh, wow.
And I know this was happening, before, but we're getting visibility into these kinds of things as well. And I think it's a really neat outcome. And a good example of what can happen when you show up for a project and say, we want to support you, and they have a good governance model, and they turn around and take that and use it to support their broader community. We're having conversations now that we weren't 4 years ago about who should be funding and what should be funded, what
Mm-hmm.
should be funded by public funds versus private funds. What role should state institutions play in sponsoring and funding open source? There's been a lot of conversations. We're having a lot of conversations now that I don't think we were having before.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and there's a lot of energy around the broader subject of open source sustainability and just really understanding like what that means beyond throwing money at projects. Like
Yeah.
what does it mean? What does it mean to curate the forest, right?
Yeah.
And so that is definitely we've seen a shift in that over the past few years.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're also seeing more experimentation with organizations who are looking to spread funding out across their dependencies. Sentry has done great work here. Stripe has done great work here. A couple of really interesting models, and then there have been other folks who have adopted the FOSS Contributor Fund framework, like I described.
Yeah.
Spotify ran something very much like it. They run one at Microsoft. They run one at Salesforce. And so I like seeing the experimentation from organizations who are trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure out how to effectively fund and sponsor open source because it means they're learning and they're going to get better at it.
That's great. And I guess taking that forward, what would you like to see change in the ecosystem?
One of the things that I think we have to continue to wrestle with is the fact that money still gets turned into time and time still gets turned into code. And the funding platforms make it easy for us to fund projects and to fund people, but it doesn't create code by itself. People do.
Yeah.
And I worry that if we think too hard about the money end of it, we think less about the participation end of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want us to lose sight of that as a community, as an ecosystem, as an industry. Right? I love that organizations are opening up their checkbooks and trying to find new and novel ways to support and sustain open source. And I'm excited to encourage those organizations to continue to have people show up for projects and have more people show up for projects. The more you understand what's important to you, the more you can effectively prioritize which projects you should be showing up for. As the funding platforms like GitHub sponsors like Open Collective make it easier to pay projects and to pay people, we really need to make sure that we are moving intentionally, that we are not bringing money to projects where it's going to create problems for the project, that we are pointing that fire hose of funding in the right direction. I think there's a lot of power in providing some framework for people who are looking to start raising sponsorship dollars for their project, and giving them some guidance on some things that they could try. But we need to understand that if we point them in the wrong direction with those, we're going to perpetuate bad behaviors within the funding ecosystem. And so I hope that we continue to iterate and learn and grow, and that we're paying attention to the other effects that we're having in the ecosystem as we work to make it easier to pay people in projects. I think that we have a bit of a hard truth to wrestle with as a community, that not every project should be funded and not every project needs to exist. Um, Part of good forest management is knowing when to clear out the underbrush and to cut down trees that aren't healthy anymore and so on. And there's this tremendous sense when you've created something like an open source project like that represents hours of lost sleep and excitement and joy and frustration and all the time that you spent in it and that the community spent into it. And sometimes it can be hard to let go of that, but if we continue to create more and more projects and more of those projects continue to request funding, we run the risk of not prioritizing the things that need it the most. I really want us to be willing to have some of those hard conversations about when it's time to deprioritize funding for some projects, because it's time for those projects, and that's hard. It's hard when you have to do it for your own project, and it's hard to help people through.
We are starting to see people sort of leave this space and like they're done with their open source project, and we haven't seen a ton of it just because software is relatively new, but we'll see more and more of it as people retire and
Right.
move on to other careers. And I think we, as a community, haven't thought of the appropriate response to that. I think a lot of people are trying to save those packages or those repos. But I think in a lot of cases, it's okay to let them die and just tell people to move on to the new package that's built using newer technology. Maybe you don't have to use this old stuff. So no, I think it's a bit of a downer, but I think it is a really important conversation. So thanks for going there, Dwayne.
Sure. The other thing that I hope for is that we continue to get better at surfacing this information at scale for large organizations who have a lot of dependencies, who want to make good decisions about who and what they should fund. Understanding health of projects over time, understanding when your funding interventions have been successful, when mobilizing people has been successful, and being able to get at this information through the lens of an organization with a lot of concerns rather than through the lens of an individual project, right? So by way of example, if your project sets up a great dashboard that tracks contributor health over time and code change rate over time and issue open and close rate over time, that might be really, really useful for community and for your community of adopters. I can't look at 2,000 dashboards. I need to see this information through a more consolidated interface. And it's not just me, it's every organization who's trying to make good decisions about funding and supporting open source. They need to see this information across everything all at once.
All right, and just to close us off, Dwayne, what would you say to other companies looking to get started in funding open source?
The first thing I would say is that you can start today with any amount. You don't have to create a giant program to support the open source that you depend on. You can get 2 or 3 people in a room and do a show of hands and pick a project that you're going to sponsor. You're going to learn from that engagement, and you're going to make better decisions down the line. So you don't have to be funding at Indeed's level or Microsoft's level or Google's level in order to be effective in the space. You just need to start where you are. And I mentioned that it takes a lot of time to understand your dependencies, and spend the time that you have, but commit to supporting them. If you're looking for tools to help you, we've published all of the materials for the FOSS Contributor Fund. They're available for anyone to use. We wrote a book about it with O'Reilly last year. I'm happy to answer questions and excited to get people involved in using that framework. And within the next 2 quarters, we will be releasing the code that we use to do that contributor analysis that I've mentioned, to help us identify people that we want to fund, and making that available for everyone. If you want any information about either one of those, you can email the open source team at opensource@indeed.com. That comes to me and a couple other people on the team, and we'll get back to you and let you know when those tools will be available and how to find them.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dwayne. Any last words to close off our fireside chat?
I want to come back to that metaphor of the open source ecosystem as a forest. If you want to understand if the forest is healthy, you need to go take a walk in it. You need to touch some leaves and rummage around in the dirt and push over a log and see what's underneath it, and so on. You don't have to take an 8-hour hike through the woods, but spending an hour walking through it to understand how things are doing, it will be good for you and it'll be good for your organization. So get out to a conference and talk to maintainers. Look at the output of your compliance tools and find some dependencies that look like they might be really important, and see how they're doing. Pick a project and start sponsoring wherever you are and wherever you can. Show up for a project that looks like they're having a hackathon, and look for an opportunity to make a contribution. If the only thing that you do is find a project that you heavily depend on and go through their old bugs and identify which ones still happen and which ones can be closed, you're helping the project, right? So there are so many ways that you can help to sustain your open source projects. Find the one that works for you and get started.
I love that. Thank you so much, Dwayne. I hadn't even thought of telling people to go through an issue tracker and just close the ones that are no longer needed. That would be so incredibly helpful. So, thank you so much for sharing that, and thanks for joining us, Dwayne. I learned a lot, and I really hope that this conversation will just help us as a community really understand what's important when we're sustaining open source and how it's more than just the money. So yeah, tune in to the rest of GitHub Universe, and we'll see you all later.
Abby, thanks so much for having me. I had a great time. Enjoy the rest of GitHub Universe. Bye, everybody.